Cosmology is usually defined as the science of the origin of the development of the universe. As we're beginning to see, it seems every religion with surviving literature brings an account of their beginning. It's my task, then, to provide you with a synopsis of these cosmologies, anchored in their historical context. Now, we've seen how the Greeks, in many cases, were ready to accept foreign influences on the origins of, the names, and some rituals relating to their gods, especially the influence of ancient Egypt. With the Hebrew, Egyptian, and Greek sources already consulted, let's review what we know about Babylonian and Mesopotamian cosmology. When we inquire about the first civilization, we quickly find that Mesopotamia and Sumer have been provided as the main contender. Mesopotamia is of course known as the cradle of civilization, and was the name of modern-day Iraq and the land of southwestern Asia situated between the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. In the centuries leading up to the 3rd millennia BC, we find the development of the cities of Uruk, Kish, Lagash, and other cities controlled by the Sumerian people. The Epic of Gilgamesh is known to have come out of Uruk, being one of the earliest known and great literary works, with doubtless parallels and inspirations for the books of the Old Testament. Centuries later, we have the Akkadian Empire taking control around 2200 BC, and on down to the establishment of Babylonia and the deified king Hammurabi, who developed some of the first known laws of government in the Code of Hammurabi. War was and has been continuous in this area. The Hittites of Syria and ancient Turkey conquered the Babylonians around 1600 BC. Then the Kassites from the east sacked Babylon, and in around 1365 the Assyrian Empire rose to power, and in the next 3 centuries conquered Babylon and expanded as far as Palestine. Centuries later, we find the Chaldeans, who, around the end of the 8th century BC, conquered Babylon, and from thence became a familiar people to the Greeks, who called many people from the east Chaldeans, using it at times to refer to astrologers and Persian magi. But over this long period of wars and development, the gods of Mesopotamia defied the tests of time, thanks to the cuneiform writing system, and their clay tablets of such numerous variety were still confounded to make sense of a fraction of them. Much of the tablets that tell us about the Assyrian and Chaldean magic systems, prayers, and worship come from the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, which was called by H.G. Wells the most precious source of historical material in the world. The library, located in the ancient city of Nineveh, contained more than 30,000 clay tablets, of which hundreds are astrological, thousands have to do with prayer, omens, incantations, and rituals. The library was named after the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, and it would seem most of the texts are from the 7th century BC. However, we do get the ancient Epic of Gilgamesh coming out of this collection, with other older stories. This king is known to have been intensely interested in collecting literature and divination texts and spells, and to that point we should make a brief note on ancient magic. The Chaldeans and Assyrians especially were deeply invested in magical formulas, and believed strongly in disembodied beings, evil demons, and held that through magical means they could summon these demons to work evil or cast them away. As the Greek writer Diodorus Siculus tells us, quote, "They try to avert evil and procure good, either by purifications, sacrifices, or enchantments." A great book to start with for anyone interested in the magic of this people would be Chaldean Magic by a French Hellenist, Assyriologist, and archaeologist Francis Lenormant, written in the late 1800s. In one of these conjurations against the 7 subterranean demons called Mascum, from a tablet found in the Royal Library, we read, "They are 7, they are 7. In the depths of the ocean they are 7, in the brilliancy of the heavens they are 7. They proceed from the ocean depths, from the hidden retreat. They are neither male or female. They are strangers to benevolence. They listen neither to prayers nor wishes. Vermin come forth from the mountains, enemies of the goddess Hea. They are agents of the vengeance of the gods." Lenormant explains that the Babylonian demons, quote, "were of 2 kinds. The most powerful and formidable were those which had a cosmical character, and whose action was exercised upon the general order of nature, and whose wickedness had power to trouble it. In one of the formulae we quoted earlier, we saw that 7 bad spirits were placed in the heavens, 7 phantoms of flame, 7 demons of the ignited spheres, forming an exact counterpart to the 7 gods of the planets who were invested with the government of the universe. For the Chaldeans, every disease of the body was caused by the work of a demon, and they developed systems for expelling them by magical means. Egypt, too, was no stranger to this kind of magic, and for both of these early peoples, not too far from each other at that, magic was conjoined to religion from the beginning. The spirits were real, the possessions were real, and even in the modern age we have episodes of possession and exorcists who deal with them, no matter what you might think about demons and their literal existence. The ancient Hindus were known for their belief in evil spirits, as were the Persian Zoroastrians. For the Greeks, Romans, Jews, and Arabs, however, it appears they learned much about magic from Egypt and Chaldea. Lenormant references one of the Harris papyri that shows an Egyptian evocation addressed to Amen, the chief god of Thebes. "Descend, descend, to the left of heaven, to the left of earth. Amen makes himself king. Life, health, strength, he has taken the crown of the whole world. Close not thine ear. The serpents with the oblique walk, may they shut their mouths, and may all reptiles be confounded to the dust by thy power, O Amen." These kinds of theurgical demands from the gods became a subject of debate for later Greeks, and it serves to show what these ancient people thought they were capable of. There are legends to the effect of cursing people with illnesses and divining the future through dreams, and 100 more scenarios that bear little resemblance to the beliefs of the modern Westerner, whereas for the Chaldeans and Egyptians, these matters verged on common knowledge. We'll want to return to the ancient magic systems that spread around the Mediterranean at some point, but let's move to the work conducted by George Smith in the late 1800s, a man who discovered parallel accounts to the Book of Genesis in the clay records of ancient Babylonia that are exceedingly older than the biblical text. Now, it isn't the case that the existence of a parallel account of Genesis overturns any validity of the Hebrew tradition, but rather supports the Hebrew tradition because you had another civilization reporting some of the same events, like a major flood, which, if a major flood historically occurred in this region, you would expect multiple civilizations in close proximity to have records of it. However, it isn't widely known how much influence can be derived from Babylonian and Egyptian sources on the Hebrew account. But for the Chaldean cosmology, which draws on the earlier civilizations of Mesopotamia, we have George Smith's work to thank, given in the Chaldean account of Genesis. Now, George credits Sir Henry Rawlinson as an early source for pointing out the coincidences between the Hebrew and Babylonian myths, and suggested that they had origins in Babylon, saying, "For some years after the cuneiform inscriptions were first deciphered, nothing was looked for or discovered bearing upon the events described in Genesis. But as new texts were brought into notice, it became evident that the Assyrians borrowed their literature largely from Babylonian sources, and it appeared likely that a search among the fragments of Assyrian inscriptions would yield traces at least of some of these ancient Babylonian legends." And just like we've pointed out before, Babylonian mythology endured in a local variance. Each god had a particular city which was the special seat of his or her worship. But the one supreme God who made the world and man seems to be the ultimate presiding force over the subordinate gods, to which they are always bound. This god at Babylon was worshipped under the names of Bel, which means the Lord or Lord, and Marduk, the sun god. At Eridu the god was Hea, and at Nippur the god was Anu. The numerous other gods are said to be names of the Creator, as the one god takes its multifarious forms in nature. In one of the incomplete hymns to Marduk, we read, "King of the land and Lord of the world, protector of heaven and earth, firstborn of the god Hea, the restorer of heaven and earth, mighty Lord of mankind and earth, the God of gods, Lord of heaven and earth, who hast no equal, companion of Anu and Bel, the merciful one among the gods. The circuit of heaven and earth is thine, the illustrious king, the mouth of the abyss is thine. Mankind, even the men with black heads, living creatures, as many as are called by name, as exist in the land, the 4 quarters of the world, as many as there are, the angels of the host of heaven and earth, as many as they are thine." This bears a loose resemblance to Genesis 2:19. Out of the ground God formed every beast of the field and fowl of the air, and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. Also note that the tree of life was widespread and well known to the Akkadians and the Assyrians, depicted on reliefs, often guarding both sides of a winged cherub. In Genesis 3:24 we read, "He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." Now, even though to my knowledge there is still no myth of the fall of man from the Chaldeans, as there is in Genesis, the same symbolism exists to suggest we shouldn't be surprised to find such a myth coming out of Mesopotamia. I think there are some thematic parallels to the fall in the descent of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar through the 7 gates of the underworld, where at each gate she has to remove one or another garment, which she gets back only when she ascends. Now, what's unfortunate about the tablets we find in Chaldean Genesis is their partial and mutilated form, making it impossible in many cases to string together meaning without speculation. But in selecting some of the lines from the legend of creation from the Cutha tablet, we read as follows, quote, "Warriors with the bodies of birds in the desert, men with the faces of ravens, those of the great gods created, in the earth the gods created their city. Tiamat gave them suck, their life the mistress of the gods created. In the midst of the earth they grew up and became strong, and increased in number." Later on we get descriptions of soldiers being sent out and a war raging in heaven, and death and plague coming to mankind. We get the word whirlwind and possible implications of the earth being shaken at its foundations. Now we know that Marduk or Bel defeats the 7-headed serpent representative of chaos, Tiamat, and it's from Tiamat that all these deformed creatures are born. Tiamat is called the chaos of the deep, reminding us of the dark abyss that God must bring to order. Another tablet reads, more complete, and describes the 7 recurring days of the week as being wicked gods, but also being messengers of the god Anu, their king. Once again, we find a theme of great conflicts at the beginning stages of creation. Reading from the tablet, quote, "In wide heavens the seat of Anu, the king, with evil purpose did they abide, and a rival they had not. Then Bel of this matter heard, and the words sank into his heart. With Hea, the supreme advisor of the gods, took counsel, and Sin, the moon, Samas, the sun, and Istar, Venus, in the lower part of heaven, to direct it he had appointed. With Anu, the lordship of the hosts of heaven, he made them share. The 3 of them, those gods, his children, night and day he had established. That they broke not apart, he urged them. Then those 7, the evil gods, in the lower part of heaven commencing, before the light of sin fiercely they came, the heroes Samas and Rimmon, god of the atmosphere, the warrior to their quarters, returned, and Istar with Anu, the king of a noble seat, chooses, and in the government of heaven is glorious." This is a primeval anarchy at work, which the gods and the supreme God have to labor consecutively to set to order. This is not unlike Yahweh in the Old Testament causing a flood to wipe out the sins rampant on the earth, or the various cycles of the earth swallowing entire generations, as we saw in the Greek account of Hesiod. And we know of a circle of 12 gods in Babylonian mythology, with Anu the sky and Bel and Hea being the 3 leaders, and arranged subordinate to the 12 are hundreds of other deities, like the Agigi, or angels of heaven, and the Anunnaki, or angels of earth. And below these were various classes of spirits and genii, some evil, some benevolent. Remember that in antiquity the demons you will hear about were not always evil. The word is based upon the Greek daimon, which stands for a divine or godlike power, like the daemon of Socrates that seems to act like a guardian angel or a personal guide. As far as I've seen, it's mainly when you read the early Christian church fathers that the pagan deities are conglomerated into the work of evil demons, but if you reference Sumerian tablets and Chaldean magical texts, you will find a plethora of evil spirits. But with the fragmentary state of these tablets and the need for a more completed story in this region, we turn to a translation of an Akkadian myth made in a follow-up to George Smith's work. I'm referencing the ancient Near Eastern text related to the Old Testament, edited by James B. Pritchard, first published in 1969. The translation I'm using to dramatize the story is given by E.A. Speiser. You can find others published in full online. First, we examine the gods of this text so you might pick up on the visual and thematic elements from the start. Apsu is the god of fresh water, groundwater, who encircles the earth and consorts with the salt water of Tiamat. From the union of Apsu and Tiamat in this version, the gods are born. Mamu is a Babylonian god of craftsmen, and in this tale, the vizier of Apsu. Apsu is eventually slain by his son Ea and begins the war of the gods with Tiamat. Now Ea is a version of Enki, a god of magic who creates the earth by defeating his father Apsu. It's Enki who also rescues mankind by advising a man to build an ark. And in the descent of Inanna, another version of the descent of Ishtar to the underworld, it's Enki who gives Inanna the means to return. Enki is a patron to craftsmen and artists, and is definitely seen as an ally to humanity. Anu is a sky god, lord of heavens, written in tales prior to 2500 BC, and Tiamat is a primeval mother goddess, representing a kind of chaos, and appearing in the shape of a kind of dragon. Tiamat is killed by Marduk, and the Tigris and Euphrates river systems flow from her eyes. So this cosmic conflict, the war in the heavens between order and chaos, was a cyclical drama for the ancient Mesopotamians. Now this text in the Akkadian is known as Enuma Elis, after its opening words, when on high. The Akkadians apparently recited it on the 4th day of the New Year's festival. The translator tells us that, quote, portions of this work were first made available in modern times by George Smith in the Chaldean account of Genesis. And despite scholars disagreeing on the date of the composition, most would assign the epic to the Old Babylonian period, or the early part of the 2nd millennium BC. Here's the beginning of the text, which I'll punch in and out of and dramatize without corrupting any of the broad themes. Firm ground below had not been called by name. Naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mamu, Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. Another translation by W.G. Lambert reads, when the heavens above did not exist, and earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first in order their begetter, and Demiurge, Tiamat, who gave birth to them all. They had mingled their waters together. So here not but chaos and the primeval waters exist, and the story tells us next that no land or marsh had appeared, and no god had yet been brought into being. Their destinies were undetermined. Then it was that the gods were formed within them. So the gods are born within the union of Apsu and Tiamat. Then Lamu and Lahamu were brought forth, and before they grow old and great, Anshar and Kishar were formed and surpassed them, prolonging their days and adding to their years. Quote, Anu was their heir and his father's rival, equal to his father was his father. Then Anu begot Nidamud, Ea or Enki in his image. And Nidamud was of his fathers the master, of broad wisdom, understanding, mighty in strength, mightier by far than his grandfather Anshar. He had no rival among the gods, his brothers. We're seeing as these gods are born, they each become greater than their forefathers, and their clamor and dancing began to disturb Tiamat in her abode of heaven, and Apsu could do nothing to stop them. Quote, their doings were loathsome, unsavory were their ways, they were overbearing. Apsu then tells Mumu, his vizier, to come here and let us go to Tiamat. They came and exchanged counsel about their firstborn gods. Apsu, opening his mouth, said unto resplendent Tiamat, their ways are verily loathsome unto me. By day I find no relief, nor repose by night. I will destroy, I will wreck their ways, that quiet may be restored. Let us have rest. Tiamat heard this and raged, saying, what? Should we destroy what we've built? Their ways are troublesome, but let us attend kindly. But Mumu advised, do destroy, my father, the mutinous ways, then shout, thou have relief by day and rest by night. And color came to Apsu's face because of the evil he planned against his own sons, the gods. And somehow the gods caught word of this and were frantic, grew speechless. But Ea, who surpassed all in wisdom, saw their tricks coming, and, quote, a master design against it he devised and set up. Ea recites this and made it subsist in the deep, and Apsu was laid down with sleep, and Mumu had no power to stir. And Ea cuts or splits Apsu's sinews and takes his crown. After Ea does this to Apsu, he binds and slays him, leaving Mumu bound behind him. Having thus upon Apsu established his dwelling, he laid hold on Mumu, holding him by the nose rope. After Ea had vanquished and trodden down his foes, had secured his triumph over his enemies, in his sacred chamber in profound peace had rested, he named it Apsu, for shrines he assigned it. In that same place his cult hut he founded. Now Ea or Enki resides in the place he named Apsu, after the god he slew, and his wife bore him Marduk within it. And Marduk grew bold and mighty at his mother's breast, and his eyes were primed with destiny. Marduk became more powerful than even his grandfather, Anu, who smiled upon him. And Anu bore the 4 winds and gave them to Marduk, telling him to let the winds whirl. And the storm brought on the stir of Tiamat and the other gods. They plotted evil against Marduk, and the gods chided Tiamat for letting Enki destroy Apsu, her spouse. Then Tablet 2 goes into the 2 forces being rallied and prepared for battles, with mighty weapons and monsters and serpents poised against each other. And afterwards, Marduk defeats and binds his enemies and slays them, bashing in Tiamat's skull with a club. It is said that he splits her into 2, stretching out one half as the heavens, with the other stretching her skin with the instruction not to let the waters of Tiamat escape. He fashioned heavenly stations for the great gods, and set up constellations, the patterns of the stars. He appointed the year, marked off divisions, and set up 3 stars, each for the 12 months. After he had organized the year, he established the heavenly station of Nibiru to fix the stars' intervals. That none should transgress or be slothful, he fixed the heavenly stations of Enlil and Ea with it. This ensues with many of the works of Marduk, but it's in the 6th tablet that we get the creation of mankind, which he creates from the blood of one of the gods he slew, saying, I will bring together blood to form bone, I will bring into being Lulu, whose name shall be man. I will create Lulu, man on whom the toil of the gods will be laid, that they may rest. I will skillfully alter the organization of the gods. Though they are honored as one, they shall be divided into 2. And there we have a summary of Akkadian cosmology and origins of the earth and man, that until recent centuries was much more difficult to understand. With this relatively recent finding, we round this off by turning back in time to the Babylonian historian Berossos, who lived during the times of Alexander the Great and flourished in the early 3rd century BC, whose works haven't survived but through references and extracts made by later writers. Berossos was a Chaldean priest of Bel in Babylon and an astronomer, and was given a statue in Athens with a golden tongue. He is said to have written in Greek and was a primary source of Babylonian history and mythology to the Greeks. So it's the account of Berossos that scholars have had to compare with the cuneiform tablets, and sure enough, what we get from Berossos is on par with the translations we reviewed. Being that the account of Berossos was so rare and stands alone as far as Babylonian history goes, it was obviously a great wish among historians to one day discover physical evidence of the ancient accounts. Now, the names of the gods that later mythologists or even Berossos used weren't necessarily the same names used by all Babylonians 2,000 years before the Christian era, but the traditions themselves stood the test of time, meaning that when we have Alexandrian scholars or later philosophers referring to these established myths, we have good evidence in the Babylonian case to show they didn't change much, thanks in no small part to their being able to retain so many of their ancient clay tablets. Now, of the cosmology of Berossos, we have to defer to the summary given by Eusebius, the Greek Christian historian known as the father of church history. Eusebius lived from 260 to 339 AD and is one of our few sources on the early Christian church and the Council of Nicaea. We read, in the very first year there appeared from the Red Sea in an area bordering on Babylonia a frightening monster named Oannes. It had the whole body of a fish, But underneath and attached to the head of the fish there was another head, human, and joined to the tail of the fish, feet, like those of a man, and it had a human voice. Its form has been preserved in sculpture to this day. Berossos says that this monster spent its days with men, never eating anything but teaching men the skills necessary for writing and for doing mathematics and for all sorts of knowledge, how to build cities, found temples, and make laws. It taught men how to determine borders and divide land, also how to plant seeds and then to harvest fruits and vegetables. In short, it taught men all those skills conducive to a settled, civilized life. And at the end of the day, this monster Oannes went back to the sea and spent the night. It was amphibious, able to live on land and in the sea. Later, other monsters similar to Oannes or Dagon appeared, about whom Berossos gave more information in his writings on the kings. Berossos says about Oannes that it had written as follows about the creation and government of the world and had given these explanations to man. There was, he says, a time when the universe was only darkness and water, and in it there were wondrous beings with peculiar forms who were able to engender other living beings. For men with 2 wings were born, as were other with 4 wings and 2 faces. Some of these had 1 body but 2 heads, male and female, and 2 sets of sexual organs. Further, there were other men with legs of goats and the horns of goats on their heads. Yet others had horses' feet, and others the body of a horse for their lower extremities, and human bodies for their upper body, which are the forms of hippocentaurs. Over all these a woman had control, named Amorka, who in Babylonian is named Thalath, Tiamat. While the world was in this state, Bel rose up against that woman and cut her in half. Out of the first half he made the earth, and out of the second the heavens. The animals who were in her he destroyed. All this, Berossos says, is an allegorical explanation. For when all was water and only monsters were in it, the god cut off his own head, and the other gods mixed the flood of blood with earth and created men. Because of this, men have reason and share in the god's wisdom. But Bel, whose name is translated into Greek as Zeus, cut through the darkness and separated sky and earth from one another and established order in the universe. The monsters could not endure the strength of the light and were destroyed. Bel, however, as he saw an empty and barren region, gave an order to one of the gods to cut off his own head and mix earth with the flowing blood and to create men and the animals that could breathe the air. Bel also created the stars and the sun and the moon and the 5 planets, which he reported in his first book. So we can see at once the intriguing similarity of the account of Berossos and those we read from the tablets. What is especially interesting is that Berossos does not hesitate to point out that this is allegorical. There is the war between Bel and Tiamat and the slaying of the great serpent. This setting up of the conflict between Bel and Tiamat resembles the account of Hesiod when Cronus rebels against Uranos for hiding the Cyclops in the earth and rejoicing in it as an evil deed. Bel cuts off his head into the flood of blood, and monsters and his subordinate gods create men from it, leaving mankind with a share of the wisdom of the gods. The monsters are then destroyed by the strength of the light, and Bel gives an order to another god to cut off his head and create men and animals. We also have a reference to the second heavens, which relates to the higher and lower part of the heavens in the tablets and other cosmologies. Bel cuts through the darkness to separate sky from earth, just like God, in the Roman Ovid's account, cut the land from the skies, the sea from land, the heavens ethereal from material air, and when we're all evolved from that dark mass, he bound the fractious parts in tranquil peace. The Babylonians had a name for the upper and lower parts of heaven as well, Anu being their overall ruler, but Anatu being the god of the lower. How about in Genesis, when God says, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And that's not all of Berossos that parallels stories in the Bible. The famous Byzantine historian Syncellus, writing in the 8th century AD, tells us that Berossos records another story, when Kronos or Enki appears to Xisuthros in a dream and revealed that mankind would be destroyed by a great flood. Quote, he then ordered him to bury together all the tablets, the first, the middle, and the last, and them in Sippar, the city of the sun. Then he was to build a boat and board it with his family and best friends. He was to provision it with food and drink, and also to take on board wild animals and birds and all four-footed animals. Sounds familiar. The Jewish historian Josephus corroborates this account centuries earlier, writing that all non-Greek people record the Great Flood and the Ark, as this is also in keeping with the Book of Enoch, where God comes to Enoch in a dream and warns him of the flood. But of course, the Greeks have their own flood myth too, with Deucalion and Pyrrha, and Plato recounts a cataclysm as well. But we'll have to wait for another episode to address the controversial flood myths and their tendency to pop up everywhere we look. It is important not to leave out of our Chaldean synopsis their proclivity for astronomy, which clearly plays a role in their cosmology, also considering their many myths about the eclipses and the planets. Berossos himself is said to have written about the moon's bright side being locked into facing the Earth, and its opposite side forever facing away from us. Perhaps it's like Pliny and the others tell us that the Babylonians had been preserving the movements of the stars on clay for hundreds of thousands of years. So yes, bury your clay tablets before the next flood comes in order that posterity may find them after the flood and regain the knowledge of the past that could have been lost. As Vitruvius, the Roman architect, wrote in the 1st century BC, quote, "The calculations of the Chaldeans must hold first place because they have the ability to cast horoscopes so that they can explain the past and the future from their calculation of the heavens. They have, moreover, left their findings, and those who are descended from the Chaldean nation have the greatest skill and wisdom in these matters. The first of these was Berossos, who settled in the city of Kos on the island and opened a school." From knowledge like this, the Greeks were keen on using the term Chaldean and the Chaldean Magi to denote some later echoes of the Babylonian doctrine. The Neoplatonic movement and successor of Plotinus after the 3rd century AD actually connected their teachings with the so-called Chaldean oracles. Now, these oracles don't originate in Chaldea, but were rather written during the 2nd century AD, during the reign of the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius. These oracles appear to be tethered to the dualistic doctrine of the Persian Zoroastrians and their magi, or Mithraic followers. Many Platonists came to associate these Chaldean writings with a teaching out of the same spirit as their own. In part, I think this is due to the magical theurgy that Iamblichus writes on extensively. But to illustrate further the effect of the Chaldeans on later philosophies, we find another interesting cosmological account given by the Byzantine monk and philosopher Psellus, born in 1018 AD. And though it's not connected with the ancient Babylonian tradition, it shows some of the beliefs associated with them and perhaps gives us a nugget of insight into a philosophical approach to their cosmology. Quote, "They assert that there are 7 corporeal worlds, 1 empyrean and the first, after this, 3 ethereal, and then 3 material worlds, the last of which is said to be terrestrial, and the hater of life. And this is the sublunary place, containing likewise in itself matter, which they call a profundity. They are of the opinion that there is one principle of things, and this they celebrate as the one and the good." Now, even though Psellus is writing this much later, we should point out about these 7 worlds the myth of the 7 gates of the underworld that Ishtar descends through to find Tammuz, who is a fertility god. Of course, 7 is a sacred number in the ancient world because of the 7 planets, or spheres, which include the sun and moon, but also from the 7 days of the week and other reoccurrences. Also interesting here is that the goddess Ishtar descends to the underworld to recover a fertility god, much like Hermes in the Greek tradition descends to the realm of Hades to recover the fertility goddess Persephone. But what we should bear in mind as we review later myths is the kind of astrotheology and archaeoastronomy that the Babylonians, their ancestors and predecessors, were definitely involved with from the beginning. Astrotheology can be explained as an attempt to identify the relationship between spiritual reality and the stars, planets, and celestial energies. It is both the realization of the work of God in the cosmos and the recognition of our place inside of it as a reflective unit of a whole, which maintains the divine patterns of nature. The study of astrotheology asks, what influence do the orbs of the night sky have on myths and religious beliefs, and takes for granted the idea that most religious texts contain both allegorical and objective allusions to the celestial objects, often in direct relationship to the function of their deities. It is not only in the earliest texts, but in the earliest monuments that we find connections between the heavenly gods and the earthly beings that worship them. Above us all and unending in every direction is the incomprehensible space of which we occupy but an infinitesimal fraction of. In the ancient world as today, the heavens displayed the mysterious presence of forces so beyond our capacity to fathom, we had no choice but to recognize the work of divine power. This presence must be intelligent on account of the intelligence that has come from it, and the intelligence required to define it. It is wise on account of the wisdom it must have taken to create it. It is good because the good that we can aspire to resembles a state of being that nature has conspired to make beautiful. Thus, if there is any repeatable sign in the heavens, and we can account for a repeatable change in our environment or our psyche during such a sign, it would work to our benefit to understand the differences between the signs and the changes, to figure out what utility they have and ascribe a meaning to them which satisfies our curiosity. What other god rules the earth like the sun? Our most practical example of the sun's mastery over our lives is, of course, the necessity for sleep. Light is wakefulness and intelligence. Darkness is rest and unknown. As the giver of life, the sun's position in the hierarchy of celestial objects is always at the pinnacle. It is the crown object, as it were, which is why our outer atmosphere is a corona, and the rulers of nations have received their coronation when they take power. J. Norman Lockyer, in The Dawn of Astronomy, tells us, in Babylonia, it is a very remarkable thing that from the beginning of things, so far as we can judge from the records, the sign for God was a star. We find the same idea in Egypt. In some of the hieroglyphic texts, 3 stars represented that plural gods. As ancient Babylon and Egypt show us, once upon a time, there was little separation between magic and religion and lifestyle. The gods and spirits existed in all things, including the cosmos, the structure of governments, the sanctuaries of temples, and the makeup of human emotion. Thus, when the gods of a pantheon corresponded with celestial objects, it was only fitting to bind them to an architecture not only built in their honor, but designed in a way to mimic their powers. As we see with the Babylonian ziggurats described by Herodotus, that is, pyramidal temples dedicated to particular deities and reserved for an exclusive priestly class, it was a common result of a nation's religious fervor to erect massive structures to the gods. These are bridges to the heavens, high places like Mount Olympus where the 12 gods dwell, suspended above the world like the 12 zodiacal segments of the ecliptic, 12 signs of the zodiac, which the Babylonians are often credited with creating. The Etemen-Nanki, for instance, in Babylon, is perhaps the most famous ziggurat, dedicated to Marduk. Etemen-Nanki means the temple of the foundation of heaven and the earth. This is relevant to the inscription on the 7-terraced ziggurat of Borsippa by Nebuchadnezzar II, who calls the ziggurat, quote, the house of the 7 lights of the earth, doubtlessly a reference to the 7 spheres, which in the ancient world were always the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. In the same order, the Babylonian gods who ruled over these spheres were Samas, Sin, Nabu, Nergal, Ishtar, Marduk, and Ninurta. We find again that for later Greeks like Strabo, the philosophic class of Chaldeans became synonymous with astronomers and astrologers. Strabo says, in Babylonia a settlement is set apart for the local philosophers, the Chaldeans, as they are called, who are concerned mostly with astronomy. There are also several tribes of the Chaldean astronomers. For example, some are called Orchini, others Borsipini, and several others by different names, as though divided into different sects, which hold to various different dogmas about the same subjects. Diodorus Siculus ties this astronomical reputation to the Chaldeans as well, when he describes Alexander the Great's entry into Babylon. While he was still 54 kilometers from the city, the scholars called Chaldeans, who have gained a great reputation in astrology and are accustomed to predict future events by a method based on age-long observations, chose from their number the eldest and most experienced. By the configuration of the stars, they had learned of the coming death of the king in Babylon, and they instructed their representatives to report to the king the danger which threatened. They told their envoys also to urge upon the king that he must under no circumstances make his entry into the city. If only Alexander listened to the Chaldeans. Whatever planetary correlations the Sumerian and later the Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian gods were given, existed in some form among the early Celts and Egyptians and became a tradition carried by the Greeks and Romans. But the idea that this astronomical wisdom wasn't bestowed from an even earlier period in civilization, say 12,000 years ago or earlier, is becoming more and more something to reconsider. The Babylonians appear to tell us as much as we've reviewed, saying that their history goes back beyond the latest flood. Indeed, how long does it take to record the heavens before you start predicting eclipses? Now, to close up with a review of Babylonian cosmology and what the ancient writers have to say about the Chaldeans, history is still in the process of correcting itself in many respects, especially when it comes to how old civilization really is, how the cycles of floods and cataclysms play a role in the birth and reset of civilization, with the finding of sites like Göbekli Tepe and Koran Tepe in modern Turkey, and with the movement to redate the construction of the Egyptian Sphinx, largely influenced by the work of geologist Robert Schoch, we will be moved to consider a much earlier beginning to humanity in general, and if their astrotheological practices of solar alignments to these sites stand the tests of scrutiny. Until then, the more we dig, the more we find, and similar to how a human jawbone found somewhere in the right strata of soil can push the date of anatomically modern humans back another 100,000 years, so too should the findings of megalithic architecture and parallel religious literature contribute to our refinement of history. If you would consider supporting the channel, you can find the Patreon link below in the description. We're really just getting started here, and it's never been a more exciting time to be an American esoteric. Until next time, be well, slay your dragons, and see you soon.